Okay, so we are moving along our introduction to the I Ching. Today we will be discussing the subject matter and initial concepts. So the first video that was done is the history and origins, which I posted probably about a month ago. Now we'll be moving. We're coursing still at a pretty moderate pace towards actually being able to complete a reading. Before we get to that, it's important that we discuss some of the, I don't want to say theories, but the larger underworkings, I guess, or framework, essentially what's under the hood of I Ching. And I've formulated this based on some of the things that I wish I knew before starting to get more involved in using it. So this first component here is the concept of change. Now, this is a big one, largely because the whole name of the book is, or as it's translated into English, is the Book of Changes. Generally, thinking about what change is, it could be, one way to think of it is something moving from rest, a state of rest, into a state of activity. This is not the way that it's conceptualized. So the word change is yi, or yi, or just the letter I as it's translated into English. So back to what I was saying before about this movement of a state of activity to a state of rest, or a state of rest to a state of activity, what I originally thought of as, and perhaps you don't view it this way, is that the opposite of change is non-change or no movement. But as we'll kind of dive into further, this is not, in the case of when we're looking at how change is defined in the I Ching, this is not the case. And this is important because this is King Wen's interpretation. So if you don't know who King Wen is, please watch my first video on this, as I discuss this in greater detail. But it's important because King Wen is the author of the core text and the judgments, which those are the main readings that, if you cast a hexagram or you're using the I Ching, that's the main component of the writing, along with the writings and the lines. So, and there's another component to this, which is it goes to what we can call a form. And clearly, there's, whether or not you believe in some type of higher power or some intelligence behind what it is that's around us, it is clear that there are these general forms. And many, what generally is referred to when maybe we're talking about not the forms, but perhaps some kind of underpinning behind physical reality. Generally, this is referred to as the laws of nature. But the I Ching doesn't have really so much to say about the laws of nature. It is more about discerning and discriminating between different archetypal forms. And from these forms we get life forms, but before you even get to that point, it's important to kind of see how perhaps there's so many of the hexagrams in the first place. Why is it that there's 64? I mean, many people have different answers for this, but a good starting place, and this was something that helped me understand it, is it's a basis point for starting to discriminate between different forms. And these forms are, there's not a separation between what's happening outside in the world and what's also then being perceived inside from a human mind. So here I have it's just a small table. I tried to chunk it. I tried to crop it down because generally these tables are quite large. But here are these are the trigrams, which are the components that make up the entire hexagram. Now these trigrams, there's 8 of them, and you can see the size of them on the left. Let me just make this a bit bigger. There we go. Now if you look up a table of these, they will be just like this, but perhaps with more correspondences. But I think this selection here is a great starting place, because it can seem overwhelming at first if you are not acquainted with this material yet. So on the left we have the figure, which is a composition of 3 lines, and we can see there's 8 of them. And each one of these has a name. So you can see they're all here. The origins of these I'll get into in a bit, but just it's good to be aware that beyond anything else, that these are essentially, you can view them as the building blocks behind what then becomes the hexagrams. And what's cool about them is that they also do have an image that is is supposed to represent them. Now, ultimately, the image is misleading, just to be aware, but again, the name, right, the translated name there on the left, which, by the way, if you're wondering where the translation came from, I believe these are Wilhelm's translations. But all of them, there's tons of essays that people have written about exactly why one's named after another, but it's best to, I personally believe it's best to develop your own relationship, not maybe definition, but relationship with each of these trigrams. If you just look at the lines on the left, they're not going to invoke that, but combining the names of them with also some images we can begin to start invoking some feelings and some of our own inspirations behind these trigrams. But it is good to have all of it there on the side, right? We can now begin to start working with these things. Oh no, that was a big noise. I think it was just a truck. Okay. So here is, I originally for this slide had a photo of Fuxi from Age of Empires, but I decided I didn't want to potentially have problems with copyright, so I instead just have his name, and here are this is what's known as the earlier heaven sequence, and perhaps you've seen this on medallions or pendants. It can be used as a token or a charm, but generally this is Fuxi is considered the creator of those trigrams. So before the hexagrams, probably long before, it's assumed that the trigrams had already existed. It's not quite known if they were used in divination or any of the same ways that the hexagrams are used, but they do appear as not only something that's very old, but beyond 2000 BC, but also a prototype for what would then become the Chinese language. Now, Fuxi, it's most likely that he's not a real person, but and this is where probably this is the closest that the I Ching gets to having some component of mythology within it. But perhaps, I mean, there must have been, at least at some point, some person. So, but if you look him up, and you can look him up, you can find the Age of Empires photo of him. You can also find artistic depictions of him. There's one where it's him and his consort intertwined, and in that story they actually create the world together. But the interesting thing to note here, and this can be very confusing, is that especially if you're looking at tables of the correspondences with the trigrams, is that there are two different orderings of the trigrams when they're in this sequence. And in this version, it's the earlier heaven, but there's also the later heaven. And the later heaven, some people say it's more common. I'm not quite sure about that. But what's confusing is that they lay these trigrams out, and they're supposed to correspond to north, south, east, west. But if you're looking at the other ordering, then those correspondences change. So just be aware that there are two separate ways of ordering them. There's none of them are considered more right or wrong than the other. It's purely one is more likely to have supposedly or apparently originated earlier than the other. Although King Wen's attributions also, he goes further into attributing them to things like mother, father, youngest daughter, oldest daughter. These were not the original, supposedly, again, the original correspondences of these trigrams. And you might have learned this in history class that the Chinese, particularly during the Shang dynasty, used turtle shells, particularly the plastron shell, which is the shell that is on the belly of the tortoise. And what the diviner would do is heat up a hot metal rod and insert it into the turtle shell. And what would happen is this would cause cracks to occur, and the diviner would then look at these cracks and these lines and come up with an answer to the question. And what's cool is they would actually write into the bone details about the date, the question, who was asked about, and then the outcome of the divination. And this also included prototypical or a prototype of Chinese language. And you can look these up as well online. And they're in museums as well. But what's theorized as one of the general ways that this was done is that if a line was unbroken, it meant yes. If the line was broken, it meant no. Although it's unlikely that there really was, during this period when they were using bones, that or the tortoise shell, they did sometimes also use shoulder bones as well from cows, but it's unlikely that there was really one or different concrete methods that were established, aside from a single diviner might have his own or her own and use their own method. So here's where we really get into some of the meat behind I Ching. So there are two fundamental principles, and I have three separate quotes here, three separate ways to think of the fundamental principle. The first one. So here is one that is very different from generally how most people probably think of change, especially in the Western world. It's change that is the unchangeable. So if we're trying to grasp what this change is, it also needs to have this element that it's contained within itself, right? It is exhaustible. And that's why that system of change, it is unchangeable. It's time, essentially. Everything is flowing one thing into the other, but there are repeated patterns, or patterns that can repeat themselves over and over and over and over again. The second quote, above and below stand in harmony. Now, this quote is similar to what some other religions have referred to, but here there is no hierarchy, and there also is no there's no duality. These things are not. The point here is to show that there's basically two things here. That you have something that's just above, something that's below, and they're both connected. And that's what's essentially being shown here. And then above and below succeed each other. This again is there's not one that is inherently always above or one that's inherently always below. There's this shifting here that's occurring. So that's the first principle. Let me move this over. Now the second principle is we have two to kind of give a greater understanding or even some definition of what these two things could be. We have Qian, which is heaven, and Chu, which is earth. So heaven and earth. Both shifting, both moving. And here for heaven, generally what is understood here as being the heaven principle is this concept of it being extraordinarily vast. And this is why many authors will refer to it as being a stand-in for the sky, right? The sky is obviously something that's very vast, and many writers have speculated that what's being referred to here is the sky. But there's further things here. We have this improvisation, which one of the trigrams is called Qian, and it also means heaven, and it also means the creative. But I think it does take it a step further, because it's not that it's just something that, when I think of creativity, I think of this liberality, but there is a very firm concept here. It's meant to be firm. We'll get into that in a bit, but again, if we're thinking about an unbroken line, that we think of something that's firm. Improvisation means that something is coming out of potentially nothing, but it's fulfilling a very definite course of action. It's following through with it completely. And the final word here, Huang Ti, is I'm not sure if it's still the term that's used, but it is, I believe, considered the original word for emperor. And what would later come after the Zhao dynasty with King Wen is this concept of the mandate of heaven. And the Chinese were the originators of this, as far as my knowledge goes. And so the emperors, their term referred to, again, this one half of the second fundamental principle, and it connects with all of these other concepts that are contained within it. Okay, and then earth. So here another word that's commonly used to refer to, or in reference with this concept of earth, is tu shi. And this is this more numinous quality of a divine concept. So, or even kind of supernatural, right? And the reason it's supernatural is that it's not something that is easily witnessed. It is concealed. But it's also something that is constantly there. It is growing, and it has this ability to create more of itself. It has this extraordinary capacity. So before, where the heaven principle is more like a something that is continually in motion, continually moving, and it has a very clear, definite course. Here, this is something that's a bit more expansive, open, but it has huge amounts of capacity. So right, this is where we get to the Chinese. There's a connection, and not just the Chinese, but to anybody who's using the I Ching. If you're going to, because you're going to encounter these concepts, but it's important, right? These are concepts that everybody has to encounter day to day. But it's good to kind of enter in, and when you see these terms that are being used, kind of have an initiation of understanding what it is that they're referring to, and not bringing in something else. So this right, when most people think of Revelation, they think of heaven, but really the revelatory aspects of the I Ching have to do with the earth, because there is this hidden quality, but through it can reveal through some kind of process, through some, could be mental, could be physical, any type of process, there is something that can be revealed within it. And then there's another term that is sometimes used, is the Shi Hai, and this was originally the mound of earth that was an altar site. And this is not at all something that is exclusive to ancient Chinese culture, but it probably through its use as something that people would come to and give offerings to, and the fact that it was sculpted or meant to look like it was something that was coming out of the earth, it became this symbol of society, especially as something that brought people together, right? Bringing them to some kind of central point. And so here, this is just a diagram explicitly showing how the concept of yin and yang is also within the I Ching. So right, we have two lines. We have, in the trigram, it's composed of either 2 or 3 or 1 yin line, and either 3 or 2 or 1 yang line. And the yang lines, the unbroken lines, generally refer to that heaven principle, or that half of the second principle, the heaven, and then the yin is earth. And at the center, there is the yin yang, which could be called, I think, sometimes it's referred to as the supreme ultimate, or could be referred to as the Tao. But that center point is more like the first principle of the two principles. But right out of that, we get these two lines, and from those two lines, that's how everything is generated. The trigrams are generated that way, and the hexagrams are generated from all of these lines. But it's important to note that these are, they're not exactly opposites. Okay, here, let me make this a bit bigger. Come over here. So I think one of the most common ways that I've seen people try to understand and interpret yin and yang is by ascribing them as genders, right? So you have yin as the female and yang as the male. But I think, especially in Western culture and just generally most cultures where we have such rigid roles for gender, it's sometimes viewed then that these principles, yin and yang, are opposites, or right, uh, part of some dual understanding, dual nature. But this isn't really exactly how they're looked at. So here I've taken a what's shown here is a just a regular diagram of a magnetic field, and I've just have one side of the magnet as yin, one side of the as yang. And so right, there's two on the magnet, but really what we're experiencing here are the fields around it. That's really what is the important concept behind the I Ching. It's not that there are certain things that are yin or certain things that are yang, certain things that are female or male or a light or a dark or any things like that. It's more about understanding that but because there's two sides, these two sides start pulling and moving things around them, causing this change, right? But just like a magnetic field, this change supposedly in the I Ching can be measured, right? Like we can measure a magnetic field. You can put a magnet in a bunch of iron fillings, and you can see a visual. You can see how the magnet's affecting those iron fillings, and that's why it's more of a polarity here. So they're both ultimately coming from the same place, but we start to get this distinction that happens. Okay, so now we're getting to the hexagram. So these forces, we're gonna push it up a notch, and so in the trigram there's 3. In the hexagram we have 6. So hexagram 9, this is known as small taming, right? We can view this hexagram as having 5 yang lines and 1 yin line. And the 1 yin line is in the 4th place, okay? So it goes from bottom to top. You have the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th line. And within each of these lines, there's also the ability for these lines to change. And so the 2 broken lines can fuse together to become an unbroken line, and the unbroken lines can push into itself and break into a broken line. So if the third line there were to change into an unbroken line, we would get hexagram 61, inner truth. So this again highlights, right? We are now putting figures, we're putting these lines down, but they're not it doesn't need to be looked at as something that's super mystical, right? These are images that we now are starting to create this tangible, and also we can track now how things are changing. One state or one form is changing into another. And this is also known as the principle of reversal, which Lao Tzu, who is the author of the Tao Te Ching, and also I put his photo on the, or his a drawing of him on the cover image of this video. And this is that if you push anything to its opposite, if you push anything to its extreme, like, right, you get something, you push temperature to its extreme heat, as hot as it can go, this then will eventually lead to extreme cold. And this is a constantly changing, contained thing in nature. Nothing as extreme can last. You can't have extreme heat forever. So, the hexagrams and the lines in the hexagrams reflect this component. And the reason that Lao Tzu called it reversal is that it's about things reverting back to this state that he defined as emptiness. Now that's something that's not actually sort of ascribed to the I Ching. That's more something that Lao Tzu came up with, but you could definitely look at it that way. And so finally now, another way to view the hexagrams, just in this introduction here, is that you can also view it as binary code. And so the yin lines we can see as zeros, and the yang lines we can see as ones. So hexagram 1 can also be seen as 111, 011. And I think now with computers, technology, all of these advancements that we have in culture, I actually think that this is a great way for Western audiences to begin to understand the I Ching, especially if they know something about computer science or programming or something like that. But it's important to note that Leibniz, who is credited with being one of the originators for binary system and also calculus, it's supposedly, and I think there's validity to this because they have found manuscripts of the hexagrams that were numbered and were shown to Leibniz, and he had a deep fascination actually for Chinese culture and particularly the I Ching, and he was one of the first people probably to actually really devote some serious study into something like the I Ching from as a Westerner. And he was very interested. He was interested in this way that even though the names of the hexagrams are all in Chinese, the same concepts, the same ideas could still be transmitted through them, through just the symbol itself. And that is what kind of inspired this idea of binary, right? Trying to reduce things into this form of zeros and ones, or basically reduce information into its most simple but yet most transmittable form. And then this also is again like this expression of on-off switches is also very important, and is again another way that we can view the lines in the hexagram, yin yang, all of that is this on-off states of sequences. All right, so that ends this video. We're slowly ratcheting it up. The next video will probably be even longer than this one, but I hope that this provides some basis to help you understand or begin to develop your own understanding of the I Ching and how useful it can be for asking questions. Thank you. Bye-bye.